version 2022. We're really happy to be back. And at this time, before I introduce our next speaker, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Joaquín Triandafilide. I'm the head at Comunidad Neuroeducas, ACHNAP. And I'm also a coordinator for a program which is very much connected to this conference. Have you ever felt like you have the level of the language, you have the contents, but you lack the methodology? Well, at the Asociación, in a joint effort with Cambridge University Press, we've set up a certificate in teaching for bilingual educational contexts. And it's a program that was launched last year, and it will be also taking place this year. Right now, I'm sharing in the chat the link to this program in case you are interested, in case you find this relevant. The topics that are being presented at the conference have a lot to do with this certificate as well. Okay, and now having said that, I want to remind you a couple of announcements. I want to remind you that you should have your real name in the tag as a participant in the Zoom session. You should write your real name. That way we can identify you as an enrolled participant. Okay, so please help us by renaming yourselves as participants that have been previously enrolled for the conference. Apart from that, we had a couple of questions, people asking what happens if I miss the rest of the day and then I want to get back. Well, you can get back later, not a problem, using the same link, which is that link is for today and for tomorrow as well. And will you be getting the videos? Well, videos will be available on the YouTube channel of the conference. I'd like to ask someone in the organization to help me post the link to the YouTube channel while I'm talking. Maybe Maria Isabel or Felipe can help me post the link to the YouTube channel of the conference, so you can subscribe, and then in due time you will get access to the videos coming, the video recording of every session of this conference 2022. Okay, all right. Other than that, I don't want to take any more time, and I'd like now to introduce Miss VickyChondrogianni to you. Dr. Chondrogianni, she must be somewhere around. If you can just turn on your camera, and then I will just say a few words about Vicky. She is an associate professor in bilingualism at the University of Edinburgh and adjunct professor at City University of New York in the US. Her research focuses on language and cognitive development in bilingual children. She has a particular interest in how children with language disorders learn language, and how we can develop language tools that lead to more effective diagnosis of language disorders in bilingual children. She has researched these issues in a range of typologically different languages, including German, French, English, Polish, Mandarin, Chinese, and Turkish. She is currently Program Director of Bilingual Development and Language Disorders at the University of Edinburgh branch of Bilingualism Matters, an information and consultancy center dedicated to bilingualism. Her presentation for today is entitled Languages in Interaction During Childhood. As children learn a second language, the second language interacts with the first language in important ways. Then she will be presenting about 3 different aspects related to this languages interaction during childhood. Okay, this is Joaquín Triandafilide speaking from Comunidad Neuroeducas. Vicky, time is all yours.
Hey there, can you hear me and see me? Yes.
Yeah,
Okay,
we can
good.
see you there.
Hi everyone, and thank you, Joaquin, for the very nice introduction, and thank you for the invite. It's really great to be able to be here with you today, even virtually. I'm just going to try and see if I can share my slides first. And okay.
Vicky, just a quick reminder.
Yes.
I want to remind our audiences that they can keep using the Q&A box to pose their questions for you, because during the, after your 45-minute presentation, we will have Ms. Jessie Urra conduct a short question answer session with you included. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Can you see my slides
Yes, we
in
can.
a presenter mode?
Yes, we can.
No, we see presenter mode.
You see presenter mode. I knew that would happen. Okay.
Yeah.
Let me just give me a second. I don't know why it's happening on this screen like this. Okay. How about now? You just see the slide, Jess?
Yeah, just the slides. That's correct.
How about now?
Presenter mode again.
You see presenter mode again. Okay, so for some reason it's not working. It's all right, doesn't matter. I just wanted it have a couple of notes and a couple of slides. So it's all right. I'll just start the presentation. So thank you again for being here today. And as Joaquin said, I'm associate professor in bilingualism, and I am a developmental linguist by training. So what this means is that I'm interested in how languages work and how they are acquired by different groups of people, of bilingual speakers, and especially children, and how the languages interact in bilingual speech. And why do we observe linguistic patterns that are unique to bilinguals and that we cannot find in monolingual speakers? So today, what I will be doing, I would like to give you a glimpse of what happens at the linguistic level when the two languages of the bilingual individual interact, and especially of the bilingual child. Okay, so that's kind of the talk for today. And just to give you an outline of the presentation, I'll be talking first about language interaction. What is it, why it happens, and is it a bad thing? Where do we find language interaction? How might it surface, and is it positive or negative? And then we're going to be looking a bit at the individual factors that modulate it. Does it only happen at early proficiency levels? And do we only find it in young children? And how do factors such as education or societal factors shape language interaction in a bilingual setting? So I'm not a speaker of Spanish, although I've researched various other languages myself. So I'll try to give you some examples from Spanish, but apologies from the very beginning if I got things wrong. So I just want to start by showing you a couple of examples of where we find language interaction or language interference, as we'll see in a second. So looking, for example, at the sound system, it is very common for Spanish speakers of English to produce something like su instead of zu, which is called devoicing of the initial S sound, and also do what we call epenthesis, so say a Spain instead of Spain. At the level of vocabulary, Spanish and English have what we called true friends or true cognates. So these are words that are spelled the same and mean the same thing. For example, obsession and obsession, so very similar in spelling and meaning, but at the same time, pie or the writing of PIE in Spanish would mean foot rather than a pie that you actually eat. So we call these false friends or false cognate words. So they may be written the same, but they mean completely different things. Then in terms of grammar, many of you may have heard your students, especially if your teachers, may have heard your students say something like the book of Juan instead of Juan's book, which is something that would be the right way to say it in English. And also very common error is people is instead of people are, which is plural in English. And also in terms of spelling, some common mistakes that a student of mine observed a few years ago was that students of Spanish learning English, they may say things like tolid, they may write actually things like tolid instead of told, or they may write things like puzzles instead of puzzles. So again, some epenthesis there and also devoicing. Yeah. So the question is why this happens, and it's all down to kind of what we call language interaction. So I'll be using the term language interaction to actually refer to the influence of one language of the bilingual individual on the other. And you may have heard about it in the form of cross-linguistic influence, or you may have heard it in the form of positive or negative transfer or interference. And usually there is a tendency to think that it's the first language that affects the second one, but actually, as we will see, the influence could go both ways. So it could be bidirectional. So language A could influence language B, but language B also could influence language A. And we're going to see a bit today what determines the direction of this influence. So let's start first, though, by some misconceptions about language interaction and its effects in bilingual children and bilingual speakers. And I will try to debunk those misconceptions today. So kind of a very common misconception, if I get this to work, is that language interaction leads to confusion. It's actually indicative of confusion. And we will see today that this is definitely not the case. Oops. Sorry. It's also meant to be indicative of language proficiency. So it's usually the early stages of language proficiency that we find the two languages interact, or language interference, but we will see today that this is actually not the case. Languages could interact across different proficiency levels. And also there is an assumption that language interaction is indicative of increased cognitive effort. And as we will see again today, it's not the case. We can see language interaction without increased cognitive effort. Just to say, I'm not monitoring questions and things in the chat right now, so as not to get too confused. My main points of the talk today, and I'll give them to you from the very beginning, is that language interaction is simply a trait of being bilingual. It actually shows that the two languages of the bilingual speaker are constantly active and interact in fascinating ways. And it is important to keep in mind that the unique features that we're going to look at today kind of suggest that bilinguals are not just the sum of two monolinguals. And this is really important to keep in mind, because that's a kind of a common assumptions when we're looking at bilinguals. We always have the monolingual comparison in mind. So let's look at some reasons why language interaction might happen. So according to one very prominent theory about how bilinguals manage their two languages, what we also call bilingual language control, the context in which languages are used impacts on how efficient this control can be. So the assumption is that the languages of the bilingual individual are constantly active. And because they're constantly active, one language needs to be suppressed, or what we call deactivated, for the other language to be used. And the cost of suppression or deactivation may depend on the context in which the different languages are used. So just to give you some examples of this kind of quite theoretical assumptions. So if we have a dual language context, like the one that you see in the middle, so in this context, both languages compete to be used in the same context, but with different speakers. So you see here, for example, there are two friends talking on the left, and then they say, oh, Maria is coming, so they switch to another language. So in this particular context, both languages are used in the same context, but with different speakers. And for that reason, it might be the case that both languages need to be highly activated. So deactivating one of the two languages would lead to high inhibition. There are also other contexts which actually may be more closer to what we recognize as, for example, immersion education. In a context like Chile, for example, which is called a single language context. So in this context, one language is used in one domain, let's say in the school or the community or work, and then a different language, let's say Spanish, is used in the home. So in that context, the two languages do not need to be activated at the same time within the same context. So for that reason, we may have moderate language activation and moderate inhibition. And then there is another kind of context where basically we have maximum activation of both languages, but at the same time, neither of them needs to be suppressed, because basically what is happening in this context, both languages are used to create sentences. So for example, what you have in the third example on the right-hand side is a context of dense code switching, where basically utterances comprise of both English and Spanish. So there is little inhibition, and actually both languages work together to form utterances in a particular kind of conversation. So these are different types of activation, interaction, and different contexts of use. Languages also interact at the vocabulary level. So I apologize in advance for this very busy graph. I'll try to explain to you what that means. So this is a way of psycholinguists to explain what is happening in the bilingual brain. So the way to read this is to start from the very top where you see the dog. This is a concept of a dog in a brain of a bilingual, let's say a Spanish-English bilingual, and they want to utter the word dog in English, as you see at the bottom of the figure. So the assumption is that they have both the English and the Spanish words in two different lexica. So one lexicons, one for English and one for Spanish. And when they try to select the word for dog in English, various things happen in their lexicon. So things, for example, are activated. So these things may be other words in English, for example, the word cat. It could also be words in Spanish that get activated, for example, gato or perro, which is the word dog for Spanish. And at the same time, semantic information is also activated related to this particular concept. So whether it's a pet, whether it barks, whether it's a loyal pet, and so on. And what gets less activated is irrelevant kind of information, for example, words like table in English or mesa in Spanish. And also the phonological properties and the spelling, depending on the mode of that word, may also be activated. So this means that for a bilingual individual to produce a word dog in one of the two languages, lots of competition happens before the word is actually produced at the phonological and at the semantic level between the two languages. And this, of course, may give rise to interference. And this is also related to how the languages are accessed, or the vocabulary of the two languages is accessed. So according to one of the most prominent theories of bilingual language processing, bilinguals have independent lexical representations for words in each language. So for example, gato in Spanish, if that's the L1, and cat in English, if this is the L2. And the assumption is that at early stages of second language proficiency, so when their proficiency in English is not very high yet, they access the word cat via their L1, so via their Spanish. So this is how they access the concept of a cat, via their L1. So the link between the word in the L1 and the concept of a cat is much stronger than the word in the L2 and the concept in the bilingual lexicon. And as the proficiency of the bilingual learner increases, then the link between the L2 word and the concept becomes stronger, so they no longer need to access the word via their L1. So supposedly at initial stages of acquisition, interference from the L1 will be stronger because the concept is actually accessed via the L1, but in later stages of the L2, the interference is meant to be less strong because the word in the L2 is accessed more directly. So, so where do we find then language interaction? So we find it, as I said from the very beginning, everywhere. We find it in phonology, we find it at vocabulary, we find it in grammar, and we also find it in spelling. So it's not just restricted to one domain. It's not just transfer of grammar from the L1 to the L2. But lots of focus, and apologies for the busy slide, lots of focus in the developmental literature in bilingual children has been on grammar. And one idea about interference has been linked to the properties of the L1, so the first language, and the properties of the second language, or let's say language A and language B, and how they may overlap. So basically, there is an assumption that if there is language A, so let's say Spanish, that offers two options. So let's say when it comes to the placement of the subject, in Spanish, as you can see, and correct me in the end if I'm wrong, you can say both John arrived and arrived John. So you can place the subject both before the verb and after the verb. But in English, you can only place the subject after the verb. So, sorry, before the verb. So in English, you cannot say arrived John, you can only say John arrived. And the idea is that this unique option that English offers will also reinforce that option in Spanish. So we may find that a Spanish-English bilingual with lots of English exposure may actually prefer to say Juan luego rather than luego Juan, which might seem more natural to a Spanish monolingual speaker. So we've also seen this in bilingual children. So we've seen that Spanish-English bilingual children are more likely to produce subject-verb constructions in Spanish if they're dominant in English than verb-subject constructions in Spanish, like their Spanish monolingual peers would do. Other areas where we find interaction, other areas of grammar where we find interaction is the syntax and pragmatics of pronouns. And there's a lot of research in languages like Italian on that. So for example, Italian is very similar to Spanish in that respect. So if you have a sentence like Maria is sleeping, dorme perché, because estanca is tired, you don't need to repeat the subject. So you see the dot there for the subject that can be dropped. You don't have to have an overt. Whereas in English, you have to have Maria is asleep because she is tired, and she is referring back to Maria, and it would be ungrammatical to say Maria is asleep because is tired, right, in English. But what we find in English-Italian bilinguals and also in Spanish-English bilinguals is that they actually like to have an overt pronoun in this particular context. So they like to say Maria dorme, Maria is sleeping because, perché lei, referring to Maria, è stanca. Now an Italian or even a Spanish monolingual may actually interpret lei as not referring to Maria, as referring to somebody else, but to an English-Italian bilingual or an English-Spanish bilingual, this may be a very kind of natural way of saying this. And so the assumption is that interference and interaction is usually found when there is overlap between languages. But it can also be found in cases where there is no overlap between languages. So this is a very nice study coming from Welsh and English and adjective placement. So in English, the adjective is always preceding the noun. So we say a small ring, and it would be ungrammatical to say a ring small. Whereas in Welsh, it's actually grammatical. It's the only grammatical option to say a ring small. So it's basically a domain where Welsh and English are very different in terms of adjective placement, but still in Welsh-English bilingual children, what we have found is that they produce adjective reversal errors. So they like to place the adjective after the noun if they're speaking English, and they like to place the adjective before the noun if they're speaking Welsh, and this depends on their dominance, basically, in English or Welsh. And interaction also happens, apart from the grammatical level, also happens at the vocabulary level. So in experiments where we measure how quickly participants respond to verbal stimuli, so these are computerized experiments where participants sit in front of a computer screen and they see pictures or words on the computer screen and are asked to respond as fast as possible, we manipulate whether the semantics of the words in the two languages are related. So for example, cara, which is the word for head in Spanish and head in English, or they're related in terms of form. So for example, cara versus card, which is related to the English, it's related in the word in English, but not to the translation, or they're false cognates. So for example, foot and pie or pie, depending on how you read it. And then we look at how quickly or how slowly they respond to the stimuli. And faster reaction times indicate that they are facilitated by the previous word. So for example, cara may actually speed up the recognition of head, but foot may slow down the recognition of pie or pie, or depending on the order of the words. Interference also happens at the conceptual level. So one of the errors that we saw at the beginning is that participants or bilingual speakers may say something like people is instead of people are. So where is this coming from? And there are some studies that have looked at that. And the study actually comes from Greek and English bilinguals. In this study, they looked at the properties of plural nouns and singular nouns in Greek. So for example, scissors and trousers are collective plural nouns in English, but they are singular nouns in Greek. In English, you would say the scissors are on the table, but the equivalent in Greek would be with a singular verb. At the same time, money is singular in English, so money is, whereas it's plural in Greek. So it would be money, the equivalent to money are, for example. And this is how basically also kind of the example from Spanish comes from. So people is plural in English, so we say people are, but actually it's singular in Spanish. So I believe it's la gente es. So the two languages clash in this respect. So in this study, what they did is they asked Greek-English and English-Greek bilingual speakers to continue sentences starting with the scissors or money. And they placed participants in a bilingual mode. So they had to do this continuation in both languages at the same time. So they were presented with sentences from both languages in the same time. And that meant that both English and Greek were activated. And when both English and Greek were activated, participants made more subject-verb agreement errors in their weaker language. So if the weaker language was English, they would make more subject-verb agreement errors in that language. If the weaker language was Greek, then it would be more errors of Greek. And it's important to note that in this study, participants were highly proficient participants, so in English and in Greek, so they were speaking both languages on a daily basis in different contexts. So what we saw in the study wasn't actually an effect of a proficiency, it was actually an effect of having both languages co-activated and, you know, having a clash in this kind of grammatical properties between the languages. So this kind of studies suggest that language interaction and effects of language interactions are not only visible in production, but they're also visible in comprehension and also in judgment. So just to give you kind of, again, a flair of studies with children. So this is a study again on production, where participants saw pictures of Disney characters, and they had to make judgments about the interpretation of the sentences. So in this study, again, with Italian and English bilingual children, children saw a picture of Minnie and Daisy in the foreground, and then Mickey and Donald were in the background. And then Minnie would say something like sono caduta, which means I've fallen. And if you can see from the Italian example, there is no subject. So it's again a case of dropping the subject. So have fallen, so there is no subject. And then Donald would say something, would make a statement about what happened. So he would say something like, Minnie ha detto che è caduta. So Minnie has said that she has fallen, meaning that Minnie has fallen. And Mickey would say something like, in Italian, Minnie ha detto che lei è caduta, so that she has fallen, which in Italian would mean that somebody else fell, not Minnie. So the first one would mean that Minnie has fallen. The second one uttered by Mickey would mean that Daisy, for example, has fallen. So what do the children in this study do in terms of, are they going to go with what Donald said, or are they going to go with, and Donald is something that the Italian monolingual children would also prefer, or are they going to go with what Mickey said, which is what the non-monolingual participants might say? And in this study, I should point out that the participants were both Italian English, but also Spanish Italian. So Spanish is more like Italian in this respect. But what is actually interesting in this study, and this study is with 9 to 10-year-olds, is that the Spanish-Italian bilingual children in the study were as likely as the English-Italian bilingual children to select Mickey's response, which is more of a kind of a bilingual option, than their Italian monolingual peers. So this study kind of suggested two things. Suggested that bilinguals do think different from monolinguals, and also what we found in this case of pronoun interpretation is mostly an effect of bilingualism rather than an effect of, let's say, language interaction. Okay, so it is observed in a judgment. It shows some level of interaction, but it also shows an effect of bilingualism. And other ways of tapping into comprehension, I've already hinted towards that, is computerized tasks where participants sit in front of a computer screen. So let's say you're a Spanish-English bilingual parsing a sentence like this: would you eat a pie or a pie, depending on how it was written. So in these tasks, these sometimes are called lexical decision tasks. So these tasks require participants to decide whether the word they see on the computer screen is a real word or not. And depending on the words that are presented, they can speed up processing. So as I said, true cognates like obsession and obsession can speed up processing. False cognates like pie or pie can slow down participants and lead to more errors, especially when participants are asked to decide which language the word they see belongs to, which, you know, without hearing the sound or seeing the context, is very hard to understand. And a Spanish-English bilingual speaker would slow down when reading a sentence such as the one that you see at the very top, when in bilingual mode, because both languages are activated. So the idea of eating a foot is not something that you would do. Okay. So, so that was the question about where we find language interaction. We saw many cases of interference, or in some cases, a few cases of positive kind of effects of this language interaction. But there are also studies that have shown that language interaction may lead to faster acquisition, so what we call acceleration, higher proficiency, and also to quicker responses. So for example, going back to studies with bilingual children, so this is a study with Polish-English bilingual children. These are children who grow up in Polish families in the UK, and they go to English mainstream education. In this study, they asked these Polish-English bilinguals to produce, to repeat English non-words that had lots of consonant clusters, that's like the ones that you see on the slide. And Polish is a language with lots of consonant clusters and very complex consonant clusters. So what they found was that the Polish-English bilinguals outperformed their English monolingual peers when repeating English non-words with lots of consonant clusters. So there was an effect of positive transfer from their L1 Polish to their L2 English. Also, studies have shown that bilinguals are more accurate and faster at learning non-words that are similar to the words of the languages that they already speak. So for example, if a word is, a non-word is more like a word that already exists in the language that they speak, then they're more likely to learn it fast and accurately. And of course, that means that if they're learning a third language or a fourth language that has the same properties, then they're also more likely to learn that third language or fourth language faster and more accurately. So that's kind of the phenomena behind language interaction. Now let's go back and see what modulates language interaction, and I'll be briefly talking about individual differences and then a bit about education and societal factors. So a language interaction goes back to this old question about the languages of the two languages of the bilingual individual and whether and how they're differentiated. So whether bilingual children have a single linguistic system or two different systems. So whether the two languages are merged from the beginning and then they're separated later in development, or whether they're separated from early on. And the assumption nowadays, and the vast literature, and I'm not going to go into that, is that evidence from students' communication and ability to discriminate subtle differences, and I'll come to an example in a second, suggests that the two languages of the bilingual individual are independent yet interacting systems from early on. And just to give you a glimpse of how we actually know this, this is an example of magnetoencephalography with an infant, a 6-month-old infant. So this is a non-invasive technique that measures the electrophysiological activity of the brain of the infant. So you can see the infant sits happily there while listening to sounds. And studies have tried to see whether children are able to discriminate sounds that belong to their own language or to their native language and other languages. And they have established that this is indeed the case. So it's not the case that the phonological system or the sound system of 6-month-old infants or 12-month-old infants is merged into a single sound system. We know that it is differentiated from early on. So hence we can say that there is language differentiation from early on in bilingual children. And what we actually see in production, but also in comprehension, is sometimes the interaction of these systems. So going back to the question of age, so kind of a very prominent assumption when it comes to language interaction and interference is that it's something that we see very early in the development and that it disappears as children grow older. So what you see in this figure, I will unpack it for you, is the results from a meta-analysis. So a meta-analysis is a study where they looked at a range of different studies. So the dots here in different colors, so the ones in yellow and in blue and red and purple represent the different studies that the researchers that carried out the meta-analysis looked at. And as you can see, there were comprehension studies, production studies, judgments, and different other studies. And on the x-axis, you can see the age of the children that were included in these different studies. And then on the y-axis was how strong the interference was that was reported in these studies. And you don't have to kind of fully grasp the figure, but the gist of it is that the studies that reported interference did so across the different ages of the children that they investigated and not just at the very beginning. So if it were the case that interference only appears here in early stages, then we would have only found studies at this place and not later on. But what we see is that there is interference across the board. I mean, there is a tendency for interference to kind of become less prominent as children grow older, but it doesn't go away. And also, as I said at the beginning, there are various studies with adults looking at vocabulary, phonology, and grammar using subtle measures such as reaction times. And they have found that there is interference and language interaction even with highly proficient and highly competent bilinguals. So language interaction is simply a trait of being bilingual and not a trait of confusion or low proficiency. And because age is not the factor that can actually explain why we find why the two languages interact, we need to look at other factors such as proficiency, and we talked about that, but also language dominance, As you're all exposed to bilingual, to children who are kind of bilingual and have different dominants, you have different dominants in the different languages, you know that they are, for example, weaker in one of the two languages. And this could be due to the proficiency, but also it could be related to how much exposure they have in the two languages, both in terms of quantity, but also in terms of quality of exposure that they get. And the assumption is that the weaker the language, the more susceptible it is to kind of influence and effects of language interaction. So the more dominant language is more likely to influence the less dominant language. Now, what is important to keep in mind is that the dominant language doesn't mean the first language or the native language, because what we know about bilingualism is that it's a very fluid state and a very dynamic state that changes all the time across the lifespan of the bilingual individual. So a bilingual individual may end up being more dominant in their second language at some point in their lifetime and less dominant in their first language. So looking now at societal and educational factors. Education is usually, for us at least, who are interested in this kind of linguistic properties, is a proxy for dominance and type of input that the children get. So, for example, we know that children from a minority language background, so let's say the Polish children that we saw in the previous study going to mainstream education in the UK, so that would be a case of a heritage language, Polish, which is spoken in the home or in the immediate community, and English being the language of the society and of mainstream education. So what we see in these children is that we may see a shift in the dominance during childhood. So at the early stages of mainstream education, they may be dominant in their L1 if the parents decide to continue speaking the heritage language as they should. But then by the end of even primary education, they may have shifted to English, which is the mainstream, the language of the community and the language of the mainstream education that they're attending. So interference shifts from L1 to L2 and from L2 to L1 during the course of the development. Now, when it comes to immersion education, the effects there are less clear and basically depend on the type of immersion program and the intensity of the immersion program, but also the quantity and quality that they receive in the language of immersion in other contexts. So whether, for example, let's say in the Scottish context, Gaelic is the language of immersion in Gaelic immersion education, but if you go to Western Isles, it's also spoken in the community. So it's not just the language of education, it's also the language of the community. And the influence of the L2 to the L1 is more pronounced when children in immersion are compared with children in regular mainstream programs, as the one that we saw on the previous slide. So at the same time, we know that societal language use is really important when it comes to bilingual development. And one big question is, how do we measure exposure to the societal language or to the home language in the first place? And there was a project that was concluded this year in the UK in a collaboration with researchers from the UK and the Netherlands, where they tried to create an online tool that measures bilingual or multilingual language exposure and develop different profiles of bilingual and trilingual children depending on their exposure. And they looked at how exposure interacts with other societal factors. And actually, in the meta-analysis that I mentioned, they found that it was the societal language over and above any exposure or other type of dominance that basically determined how the two languages interacted and whether the L2 would influence the L1 or the L1 would influence the L2, rather than all these other subtle measures. It was basically, were the children living in Italy? So if the children were living in Italy, then Italian would influence their English. Were the children living in Greece? If they were living in Greece, then Greek would influence English, even if they were going to English immersion education, rather than vice versa. So the effect of the societal language was very strong. So to sum up, and I don't know how I'm doing in terms of time, what I kind of claimed today was that language interaction in bilinguals is simply a trait of being bilingual. It shows that the two languages of the bilingual speaker are constantly active and interact in fascinating ways. It is not only found in the grammar of young bilingual children, but it can affect production and comprehension, and can be evidenced in older bilingual children and in adults. Oops. And it can go both ways. It can be, namely, can be bidirectional, so not only from the first language to the second, but from the second also to the first, depending on the child's exposure and language domain. And thank you very much, and I look very much forward to all your questions.
Vicky?
Yeah.
Hello, can you hear me? This is
Yes,
Jessie.
I can see you as well.
Hi. Yeah, we are waiting now for the questions. Okay, now you can see me. Fantastic. Yeah, I was about to tell you that we have 4 minutes, well, now 1 minute left, okay, in order to get a question.
Okay.
Yeah, right now, so I'm selecting one. Just give me 1 minute
Do you want
and
to stop
I will
sharing?
be back to you. Fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much. Okay. Okay, Vicky. Well, first of all, thank you very much, Vicky. That was a very interesting presentation. Some people were texting us that it was everything that you said. It was very interesting and useful, of course. And I have one question here from Nedielka, and she says, do personality traits affect the preference in using L1 or L2 in bilingual speakers? Is there any literature in this respect?
Yes, that's a very good question. It's not my area of expertise, but there is a long literature on individual factors such as personality. I mean, I wouldn't say necessarily personality, but so much also motivation. So within that kind of area of research of whether a particular individual is more likely to use one of the two languages. But it's never only one thing. It's always a combination of these factors. So it could be the individual's motivation or the individual's kind of personality, and but also, you know, the context of interaction. And then I guess also it's the question of what we mean also by personality traits. Is it something that refers to kind of their psychological status, or do we mean personality? We mean like individual differences in terms of memory, aptitude, how quickly and successfully they learn, they're able to learn languages, and so on. So yeah, there is a long literature on that. I can share a couple of references. I mean, books that you can use as a first call of reference, and then move on to something else. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, before going to the next question, I'm going to remind all the participants and attendees that we have a questions and answers button. You know, there's a section at the bottom of the Zoom window. And I have another question. Yes, Triana Julio is she's mentioning here in Spanish, but I'm going to read it in English. Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Triana says, Vicky mentioned that learning two languages doesn't mean that is more cognitive work. She didn't understand very much that part that you presented before.
Yeah, so I can go back to this bit of the presentation where it's about the context of use. So there is this assumption, sorry about this, I should do it more efficiently, but no. So there is this assumption that, our brain has some sort of like finite cognitive resources. So, learning one language is hard, learning two must be even harder. But actually, we know that this is not the case, in the sense that, for example, even looking at the picture of this bilingual child that is sitting under a hair dryer from Mars, as they called this particular like device that they have on their head, and are able to manipulate those two languages. It doesn't take effort to do this, but also, I mean, it doesn't take effort to kind of code switch. So in this example, for example, as I mentioned, it takes more effort to kind of use the different, the two languages if they have to be used in the same context and they need to be addressing different people. But then when it comes to using them together to form sentences, studies have shown that the cognitive kind of effort that is needed for that is very low. Okay, so I'm not saying that learning languages is not hard, but once you get to use them and you get to use them efficiently and fluently, perhaps it's not as difficult as people assume. So I don't know if that satisfies your query.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Well, participants are commenting here in the chat box that is well, they are saying thank you very much for sharing references. And I have one last question. Okay, it has no name, but because it was sent by a private message in this case, and they are asking, is there any relationship between the hours exposed to the English language at school rather to the other exposure at home? Because in Chile we have this reality in which we have not many hours of English language at schools. What do you suggest? Have you ever seen that reality in other schools?
So sorry, just to repeat. So the question is about the hours.
The question is about the hour of exposure of the language in this case.
Yeah. So I think it's an issue. It's an issue for us in the UK as well, because when it comes to modern foreign languages, I mean, children get at most 2 hours a week. In some cases, 2 hours every other week. And to me, you know, this is not enough, because you know, and also it's not enough also if it is combined with a method that doesn't actually give you a lot of support to figure out how the languages work, because as we know, you know, languages need input and exposure, and being exposed to just some kind of I don't know, light communication 2 hours a week perhaps is not enough for a child in particular to pick up the properties of that language. And yeah, so this is something I don't think it's something that you only see in Chile. I think it's just a more general discussion about how many hours are necessary, and what the goal of the education is. Do we just want them to be able to pick up a few phrases so they can order coffee when they go to Italy, for example? Or do we want them to get a more meaningful understanding of that language and reach a particular proficiency level that will allow them to kind of continue learning this language later on in life and perhaps studying that particular language?
All right, thank you very much. And one last question. Patty Diaz said, I'm an English teacher of English, and I have had some problems with Spanish speakers, colleagues, because when they ask something in Spanish, the children answer in English. Colors, for example. I think the concept is right, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, is that a problem if it's an English immersion? I guess you would want them to speak in English, right? Yeah, but that means that if they, so vocabulary, if they know the word in one of the languages, it means that they have the concept, you're very right, and they can access the word or the lexical item that they know in either of the languages. So there are different ways of measuring, for example, vocabulary development. So one is to look at just how many words they know in each language, but then there is another way of looking at the concept, which means that if they know the word in one of the two languages, it means that they have the concept of a particular word. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Now we're having more questions and we have little time to respond to this. Alexandra Soto says, what kind of teachers should teach many subjects in order to develop an immersion program for preschoolers and first graders?
And I can actually read it. So it says
Yes. If the available teachers were not fluent in the use of L2 language, would they need an EFL teacher's assistance or assistant?
So I'm guessing you mean teaching the main subject in the second language. Yeah, I mean, it's important that children are provided with kind of complex enough input in either language. It could be the first language, but definitely the second language, to be able to pick up the constructions. So yes, I guess preschools and first graders, teachers may simplify the language, but I think that doesn't mean that their input of the language of the teachers is not diverse enough and rich enough. I wouldn't, I would think that you don't need a native speaker of English, for example, but definitely a competent speaker of English to teach at any level of development.
Thank you, Vicky. Lindsay says, is it preferable for a student to learn different subjects in both languages at the same time, or to be taught different subjects in a chosen language?
I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's not really my area of expertise, so I can only speculate. But what would the point be of learning the same subject in the two different languages? I mean, it would be, I would need to see what the learning outcome is. What is the point of doing that exercise? Yeah.
All right.
Well, but it's not
Anna
my area of
says,
expertise, so I cannot really answer that. I'm sorry.
No, but thank you very much. Yeah, that is fantastic that you are answering that, because now other teachers are asking more questions. For example, Ana Pino says, thank you for your presentation. I have a question about the interaction of the languages when being bilingual. Is it normal that you are constantly interrupting yourself when speaking because you find yourself using words from both languages?
Yeah,
in
that's
Chile
actually
here, we said that Spanglish.
Yeah, so this is very, very normal, and it's actually evidence for some of my colleagues who do production of bilingual speech and psycholinguistics. Actually, those interruptions are of real interest to them, because what that means is that while you're speaking in English or in Spanish, it means that you're already thinking of your next sentence, the form of your next sentence, and the words that you're going to be using in the next sentence, and whether they will be English or Spanish. And that creates a lot of interference because, as I said, both languages are active. So as you're planning your utterance, all these words and structures from the two languages are in competition. So it's not surprising at all, and it's very typical of bilingual speech, and actually evidence that both of the languages of the bilingual speaker are activated and kind of compete for production.
All right, Vicky. I'm guessing that was the final question. So now we are closing this presentation. Thank you very much, Vicky. It was a wonderful presentation, and thank you to all the attendees that were very active as well.
Thank you very much for having me, and good luck with the rest of the conference.
Thank you. Okay, for all people now, remember that now we have a very short break, and you are all welcome to the next section, which is the third presentation with Maria Francisca Kelly from Chile. And the name of the presentation is Building Students' Autonomy with Positive Education. I'm going to see you there. Thank you.